Part 1. How Medieval Peasants Survived Plagues, Famine, and Lords. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we begin with a story about people who had it worse than anyone you know, except maybe your inbox on a Monday morning. So, get comfy, dim the lights, maybe grab a lukewarm beverage, and let's slowly wander through the world of medieval peasants. They were, in short, constantly tired, almost always hungry, and somehow managed to survive things that would make us call in sick for a week, or maybe never leave our beds again. The life of a medieval peasant wasn't exactly glamorous. There weren't any spas, no Netflix, no delivery apps. You got your meals from whatever you could grow, hunt, or beg for, which, let's be honest, was often just enough to keep your stomach from grumbling too loudly. And of course, there were lords. Always lords. Lords who, naturally, believed that your life existed mainly to pay taxes, work their fields, and occasionally die in a way that made them look heroic in their family chronicles. Peasants worked long, monotonous days. Imagine waking up at sunrise, which was often before sunrise thanks to unreliable clocks and the judgmental sun, and then laboring through chores that never ended. You'd plow, sow, reap, tend livestock, repair fences, grind grain, and somehow keep your family alive through it all. And don't forget, there was always the looming threat of famine. Medieval harvests were temperamental. A rainy spring could ruin an entire season. A dry summer might do the same. And if famine hit, well, you didn't just skip a meal or two. You starved. Slowly, uncomfortably, with the constant background soundtrack of desperate neighbors quietly panicking in the fields around you. Oh, and there was plague. The Black Death, of course, is the most famous, but really, Europe had an ongoing subscription to disease. Fever, buboes, coughing. It was basically the medieval version of a subscription box, except you didn't get cute little surprises, just illness. Some peasants just got lucky and survived. Others didn't. And there was no health insurance, no magic doctors, just a mix of prayer, superstition, and whatever herbal remedies they could scrape together. But peasants were survivors. Somehow. Generations of them adapted to living with constant scarcity. They developed weird food hacks, like eating roots that modern people would politely refuse, or boiling odd combinations of vegetables to stretch a meal. They learned how to read the weather by the clouds, how to preserve grain, and even how to navigate a system where the Lord could demand more than you technically had. Because why not? A lord's whim was as fixed as gravity, and ignoring it was generally a terrible idea unless you enjoyed fines or beatings. Socially, peasants were tightly knit. They relied on neighbors, extended family, and even random strangers to survive. Festivals and holy days were rare but precious breaks from labor. And during those moments, the peasants might have laughed, danced, or even flirted before returning to the grind. Their culture was understated and practical, full of wisdom accumulated over generations. Not exactly riveting if you like drama, but impressively durable when you think about it. One curious thing is that medieval peasants were remarkably resilient to disease, relatively speaking. Frequent exposure to pathogens meant their immune systems were probably hardened, at least compared to city dwellers who experienced sudden plague outbreaks. The downside, of course, was that when a pandemic hit, large numbers still perished. But the survivors developed coping mechanisms. Herbal tonics, quarantine practices, or just an acceptance that some neighbors would vanish without fanfare. It sounds grim, but life's grimness was ordinary. They handled it quietly. Let's float over to another aspect of their survival: famine. Famines weren't just about missing meals, they were about the slow degradation of food quality, the disappearance of certain staples, and the need to improvise. Rye bread, for example, could be made from grain so old it had sprouted little green shoots, technically edible, technically not great. Sometimes peasants had to eat bark, weeds, or gruel that barely qualified as food. Yet somehow, humans survived. Bodies shrank, but hearts kept beating, and hands kept working the soil. It was monotonous, sometimes tragic, but oddly rhythmic if you squinted at it in the right way. And then there were the lords. Peasants were, for the most part, tenants of the land they farmed. Lords expected rent, taxes, and loyalty, while peasants expected, well, usually to survive another year. Sometimes lords were mildly reasonable, sometimes absurdly cruel, and sometimes just incompetent. But either way, peasants learned how to navigate these tiny bureaucracies of oppression. They developed clever ways to reduce dues, bargain, or quietly ignore unfair demands. A peasant's life required not just physical stamina, but mental agility. Even leisure was practical. Storytelling, for instance, served as both entertainment and instruction. Legends, saints' lives, and moral tales were passed along, often at the end of long workdays, under flickering candlelight or in the open air. These weren't thrillers, of course, more like gentle reminders that life was hard, and you weren't alone. Music, when it appeared, was functional and simple, using whatever instruments survived years of hard work. Even humor was subtle. A sarcastic observation about the Lord's appetite for taxes, or a joke about someone's unfortunate mishap in the field. Religion played a huge role. Churches weren't just spiritual centers, they were social and support networks. Feast days, saints' days, and holy festivals were markers in an otherwise repetitive calendar. Prayers weren't always about divine salvation, they were often about practical concerns, like please let my cow survive another winter, or may this crop not fail entirely. Religion was deeply interwoven with survival, rather than lofty metaphysical thought. Interestingly, peasants' relationships with their own bodies were also shaped by necessity. Work was constant, so physical strength mattered. Illness was frequent, so understanding symptoms and basic remedies was essential. Hygiene was, predictably, rudimentary by modern standards, but there were surprisingly sophisticated practices: communal washing, use of herbs, and a practical knowledge of water sources. They didn't know germs, of course, but they had a sort of experiential epidemiology that worked well enough to keep some communities thriving. Even mortality was normalized. Children died, spouses died, neighbors disappeared. The cycle of life and death was continuous, like a clock ticking in the background. Funerals were quiet, functional affairs. Grief existed, but it was woven into the fabric of daily labor. Mourning didn't stop the plowing, the baking, or the weaving. Survival had a relentless rhythm, and peasants adapted to it. So, by the end of a long, dusty day, a peasant might collapse into a straw mattress, exhausted but alive. Tomorrow, the cycle repeated. Sunup, labor, scarcity, illness, small joys, minor victories, tiny tricks to keep the body functioning. They weren't heroes in the romantic sense, just persistent humans navigating relentless circumstances. And somehow, despite plagues, famine, oppressive lords, and sheer bad luck, they kept going. Next, we'll drift gently into how certain peasants developed strategies to cope with feudal obligations that could otherwise swallow them whole. And we'll see that even in a world ruled by cruel lords and bad harvests, ingenuity, community, and quiet resilience could carry people through. But for now, take a slow breath, Imagine yourself in a thatched hut somewhere in the misty English countryside and feel the simple, grinding rhythm of peasant life. Part 2. Taxes, lords' whims, and seasonal crises. All right, so let's ease back into it. Imagine yourself still in that little straw-filled hut, maybe with the faint scent of smoke from the hearth, and let's talk about how peasants dealt with life when the world seemed determined to make things more complicated than necessary. Because naturally, life wasn't just hard, it was also bureaucratically difficult. Taxes were the ever-present cloud hovering over peasant life. The feudal system was, at its heart, a giant hierarchy designed to extract labor and produce from the lowest tier of society. Peasants didn't just work their land for themselves. They owed portions of their harvest, livestock, or labor directly to the Lord. And these demands could be generous, if you're speaking in the terms of someone who enjoys slow suffering. A single family might owe a fixed annual rent, plus additional contributions during harvest time, plus fees for using the mill or oven, plus occasional arbitrary fines whenever the Lord woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Of course, discovery could mean penalties, but still, humans will find loopholes even in the rigid, dusty machinery of feudal obligations. Seasonal crises made taxation a living nightmare. Winter meant frozen ground. Summer could bring drought. Spring might flood the fields. Any of these could reduce the harvest. Yet the Lord's demands rarely adjusted with the weather. Imagine working dawn to dusk, surviving on barely enough to keep the family alive, and then someone in fancy clothes expects exactly the same portion of your rye bread as if it were a year with perfect sunshine and no flood. It's an excellent reminder that empathy wasn't a prerequisite for nobility. And then there were the lords themselves, which brings us to the unpredictable part of medieval life. A peasant could live quietly for years, following every rule, planting every seed in the recommended row, keeping chickens and pigs and cows in accordance with unwritten village etiquette. And then suddenly, the Lord might decide something arbitrary. You owe an extra bushel of wheat because I had a fancy dinner last night and ran out of bread. Or, you must repair the east wall of the manor before next Tuesday. And that's if the Lord was competent. Incompetence introduced even more chaos, like contradictory demands or forgotten agreements that still had consequences. Peasants' responses to these whims were a mix of resignation and ingenuity. Some accepted the extra work quietly, internalizing frustration like a slow burn. Others sought counsel from the village elders, who often knew obscure customary rites that could limit the Lord's power. And a few occasionally attempted minor acts of rebellion. Nothing dramatic, no burning castles down, but subtle resistance, hiding extra food, losing tools, or exaggerating work difficulties. Survival required a blend of patience, cunning, and just a pinch of daring. Let's float over to another recurring crisis: seasonal food shortages. The medieval diet for peasants was repetitive, unimaginative, and, when things went wrong, extremely thin. Rye, barley, oats, sometimes wheat if you were licky. Vegetables like cabbage, beans, onions, and leeks. Occasionally some meat, usually pork, and even more rarely, beef. Dairy might include cheese or a little milk, and that was considered luxury in many areas. Add famine into the mix, and suddenly weeds, roots, and acorns became dinner. Some historians suggest that creative food improvisation became an essential skill, and we can assume no Michelin stars were involved. Malnutrition wasn't just unpleasant, it made peasants more vulnerable to disease, injury, and even accidents in the fields. A weak body could collapse under the laborious demands of plowing or harvesting, and there was no occupational health or workers' compensation. Injuries often meant permanent incapacity. But communities sometimes had informal support networks. Neighbors would help carry loads, share food, or assist with repairs. The principle was clear: survive, because tomorrow the fields don't care about your pain. Religion also intersected with these crises in subtle ways. The church offered occasional charity, such as distributing bread or grain during lean times, or providing care for the sick. But this support was limited, often ritualized, and never guaranteed. Peasants prayed not for abstract salvation, but for immediate survival, another crop, another day. Saints and miracles were convenient narratives that offered structure and hope in an otherwise exhausting existence. And speaking of hope, life expectancy for a peasant was modest. Child mortality was high. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and dysentery were common. Accidents in fields, forest, or rivers could end life abruptly. But communities sometimes had informal support networks. Neighbors would help carry loads, share food, or assist with repairs. The principle was clear: survive, because tomorrow the fields don't care about your pain. Education, for the most part, was practical. Children learned labor first: how to tend animals, sow seeds, reap crops, mend fences, cook, clean, and navigate both social and natural hazards. Reading and writing were rare skills, sometimes limited to those interacting with lords or clergy. Knowledge was transmitted orally and experientially. The wisdom of generations, what herbs cured which ailments, how to predict weather from cloud patterns, or which streams were safest to drink from, was life itself. Let's drift toward leisure, which existed, if subtly. Storytelling, singing, and communal tasks provided a sense of connection. Games were simple, often competitive, and sometimes educational. Races, mock combats, or logic-based contests that reinforced practical knowledge. Even humor thrived: subtle, sarcastic, and observational. A peasant might quietly joke about a lord's ridiculous hat, or the absurdity of a tax inspection, safe in the comfort of community and the occasional anonymous laughter behind a thatched wall. Travel, for most peasants, was limited. Movement beyond the village required permissions, often a written pass from the lord. Markets and fairs offered opportunities to trade, purchase rare goods, or hear news from distant places. It was a brief glimpse of life beyond the routine, a minor adventure in a mostly static existence. And these glimpses reinforced a sense of relative stability. You knew what to expect in your village, which made surviving slightly easier than navigating entirely unknown territory. The rhythms of time were closely tied to the seasons. Work, festivals, and religious observances created a predictable framework. Spring, sowing seeds, repairing tools. Summer, tending crops, haymaking, and praying for rain that wasn't too much or too little. Autumn, harvest, storage, preparing for winter. Winter, mending clothes, maintaining fires, repairing homes, and praying quietly for survival until the thaw. It was repetitive, yes, but repetition was comforting in a world where uncertainty could mean death. And finally, there was resilience. Peasants, by necessity, cultivated emotional, physical, and social endurance. Generations passed down not just crops, but strategies, coping mechanisms, and knowledge. The constant interplay of scarcity, labor, and occasional festivity built a quiet, steady human rhythm. Lives were short, often brutal by modern standards, yet filled. Part 3. Village Strategies, Minor Rebellions, and Plagues. All right, let's drift back into the slow rhythm of peasant life. Imagine yourself still in that humble hut, the fire crackling faintly, and let's talk about how peasants survived, not just as isolated individuals, but as part of a slightly chaotic, loosely organized village community. Because it turns out, even when lords demanded the impossible and plagues lurked just beyond the horizon, peasants often found clever ways to get by, quietly, subtly, and without much fanfare. Villages were small, tight-knit, and a little bit messy. Families lived in simple homes, often one room or at most two, thatched roofs, dirt floors, and barely enough space for everyone to sleep without elbowing a sibling awake. Livestock might share part of the structure, which made mornings, aromatic. But the close quarters also meant cooperation was necessary. Tasks were divided, shared, and sometimes rotated. One family might grind grain, while another tended animals. Children helped as soon as they were physically able, learning not just labor skills, but also the social art of mutual aid. Resource pooling was essential. Grain, firewood, water, and sometimes livestock were shared in informal arrangements. If a family's harvest failed, neighbors might lend seeds or offer a portion of their stored grain. And when misfortune struck, whether from plagues, bad harvests, or even just a cold snap, communal care could make the difference between survival and starvation. Of course, generosity had limits. No one wanted to give away all their stored grain and end up starving themselves, but the practical balance between selfishness and cooperation defined village life. Speaking of plagues, let's talk about the ever-present background noise of medieval disease. The Black Death, the sweeping waves of smallpox, typhus, dysentery, and influenza. They weren't dramatic in the way modern movies portray epidemics. There were no panic-stricken heroes or cinematic escapes, just slow, grinding loss and adaptation. Villages responded with a combination of superstition, observation, and practical quarantine measures. Sick individuals might be isolated, though often with minimal medical understanding of contagion. Herbs, prayers, and old wives' remedies were administered, mostly because it was better than nothing. And sometimes, stubbornly, life went on, even in the face of illness. Interestingly, survival often came down to small, practical rules. Keep your drinking water separate from animals, boil what you can, keep grain dry, rotate fields to reduce infestation, and pray quietly to whatever saint seemed appropriate. This wasn't glamorous knowledge. It was the kind of slow, learned expertise that let communities endure. Death was normalized. Illness was normalized. Survival strategies were learned, shared, and refined, almost unnoticed over generations. Let's drift toward another dimension: minor acts of rebellion. Peasants rarely rose up in grand cinematic revolts, but small, quiet acts of defiance were common. Refusing to hand over an extra bushel of wheat, neglecting to repair the Lord's fences promptly, exaggerating losses due to pests or weather, hiding produce, or subtly undermining unfair inspections. These weren't heroic in the classical sense. They were practical, and they were effective enough that lords often tolerated them, or at least grudgingly accepted them as part of the background noise of feudal life. Sometimes, rebellions did escalate. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England is a famous example. Villagers, tired of unfair taxation and arbitrary demands, marched on towns, confronted officials, and demanded redress. But even then, the results were messy. Leadership was loose, organization minimal, and reprisals severe. The revolt was quickly suppressed, which was the standard ending for peasant uprisings. The takeaway: quiet, persistent resistance was far more common than dramatic insurrections, and probably more effective for day-to-day survival. Another survival strategy involved diversification of labor. Villagers didn't rely entirely on a single crop or source of income. Fields might produce grains, legumes, and vegetables. Pastures yielded cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens. Families engaged in weaving, pottery, blacksmithing, or minor trade. If one part of this fragile network failed, others could partially compensate. It was a bit like having multiple safety nets, except all of them were made of slightly frayed rope and occasionally gnawed by mice. Seasonal migration also played a role. Young adults might travel to nearby towns for temporary labor, fairs, or apprenticeships. Monasteries sometimes offered work, or at least food, during hard seasons. And while travel was risky, disease, thieves, accidents, it offered the possibility of supplemental income, knowledge, and access to tools or goods otherwise unavailable in the village. So even in isolation, mobility was a subtle survival mechanism. Hygiene, as you can imagine, was rudimentary, but surprisingly systematic in some cases. Washing was infrequent by modern standards, but herbs and ashes were used to clean bodies and clothing. Communal latrines or wells required rules, if only to avoid immediate disease outbreaks. Villagers learned by observation. If certain practices kept disease away or livestock healthy, they were repeated. Empirical trial and error governed daily life more than theory or doctrine. Let's talk briefly about childcare. Peasant children learned from observation, imitation, and practical instruction. From a very young age, they participated in labor, helping with animals, carrying water, tending gardens, or weaving. Play was intertwined with instruction. Games often taught agility, balance, or social coordination. Survival was a constant, quiet lesson embedded in the rhythms of daily life. It's a little grim from a modern perspective, but it was effective. Children who survived learned skills necessary to maintain both household and community stability. Food, of course, remained a central concern. Preserving crops through drying, smoking, and fermentation allowed some buffer against famine. Hunting and foraging supplemented diets, though success varied seasonally. Villagers developed subtle knowledge of which roots, berries, and nuts were edible, which fish could be caught and preserved, and which weeds might fill a stomach in an emergency. Meals were functional, often repetitive, and rarely luxurious, but they sustained human life against the persistent backdrop of scarcity. Finally, social cohesion helped in ways that were not immediately visible, but deeply effective. Gossip, storytelling, collective labor, and shared religious practice reinforced social bonds. Funerals, weddings, and festivals punctuated life, providing moments of connection and respite. Humor, especially subtle sarcasm or darkly ironic observations, relieved tension and reinforced communal identity. Peasants survived not only because of labor or knowledge, but because of networks, human relationships, and collective adaptation. So, as night falls over our imaginary village, and the smoke from hearth fires curls lazily into the air, picture the gentle rhythm of peasant life: early rising, constant labor, small meals, shared burdens, minor rebellions, and quiet endurance. It wasn't glamorous, dramatic, or romantic, but it was life, and it was survivable. Over generations, these rhythms produced resilient communities capable of weathering plagues, famine, and the unpredictable whims of lords. Next, we'll drift into the ways that peasants' material culture, homes, clothing, tools, and domestic innovations contributed to survival. And we'll do it with the same gentle, slightly sarcastic cadence, letting the narrative float slowly, like a candle flickering in the quiet of a winter evening.
Part 5. Hope, Humor, and Human Resilience. All right, let's drift one last time into the quiet, slow world of medieval peasants. We've talked about homes, tools, clothing, seasonal crises, taxation, lords, and plagues. But survival wasn't just a matter of physical adaptation. It was also mental, emotional, and social. How did people keep their spirits from cracking under the relentless grind of medieval life? Well, it turns out humans are surprisingly clever about that too. Hope, in small doses, was crucial. Peasants lived within the cycles of seasons, the rhythms of labor, and the occasional festivals. They didn't dream of luxury. They dreamed of a successful harvest, a surviving child, a relatively painless winter. And those small hopes were enough. When work was exhausting, illness was present, and famine hovered, hope was practical. It motivated people to rise in the morning, tend the fields, feed the animals, and continue despite everything. Not grand heroics, but very human perseverance. Religion provided structure, meaning, and occasionally relief. Saints, relics, prayers, and holy days were woven into daily life. But these weren't just lofty abstractions. They were tools for psychological endurance. Lighting a candle, whispering a prayer, observing a feast day, or attending a festival gave rhythm to the endless labor. Miracles and saints were stories, but they were comforting stories. They reminded peasants that the world had order, even if that order wasn't always fair. And if nothing else, prayer was a socially acceptable way to express frustration, fear, or grief. Humor also had its place. Peasant humor was dry, understated, and practical. Jokes about the Lord's absurd demands, clever wordplay, or darkly ironic observations about life's misfortunes were common. Humor didn't remove the hardship, but it allowed peasants to process it. Laugh quietly at the absurdity of paying an extra bushel of wheat because the Lord needed more bread for a feast? That's survival of the spirit. Small jokes, shared smiles, and gentle teasing of neighbors or authority reinforced community bonds and offered psychological relief. Community itself was central. Villagers relied on each other for labor, advice, and emotional support. Collective work, shared resources, and informal governance reduced the constant stress of survival. People could trade favors, help care for sick children, share firewood, or pass along knowledge of weather patterns or crop management. Even gossip, which modern people dismiss lightly, was essential. It transmitted knowledge, enforced social norms, and subtly reinforced cohesion. Survival was as much social as it was physical. Families were another cornerstone. Household units worked as teams. Parents, children, siblings, and extended relatives all contributed to labor, decision-making, and morale. Emotional support was subtle, guiding children, sharing stories, maintaining rituals, but it was persistent. Love in a peasant household wasn't always sentimental. It was practical, tied directly to survival. Feed the children, mend their clothes, teach them work, and the family continues. That was resilience expressed in everyday life. Even superstition had a role. Peasants carried charms, performed small rituals, or observed omens, not always out of belief, sometimes out of tradition or habit. A lucky herb, a carefully drawn line in the soil, or a whispered caution against angering spirits offered structure in a world where misfortune could strike arbitrarily. And whether or not these actions worked, they provided psychological comfort. Sometimes feeling prepared was almost as important as actually being prepared. Education, as mentioned before, was practical and experiential. Children learned farming, livestock care, tool maintenance, herbal medicine, and social skills. These lessons weren't just technical. They built confidence, agency, and a sense of competence. Even small accomplishments, a well-plowed field, a surviving calf, a repaired roof, were victories that reinforced resilience. Life's pressures were constant, but so were these subtle successes. Even seasonal rhythms offered psychological support. Work in spring, summer, autumn, and winter created predictability. Festivals, feast days, and communal celebrations broke monotony, even if briefly. Music, singing, storytelling, and dancing reinforced social cohesion and provided minor escapes from the harshness of daily life. Life was difficult, but humans are remarkably adaptable when their routines offer structure, however grueling. Let's pause on mortality. Peasants lived with the constant awareness of death. Children might die, neighbors might vanish, plagues could sweep through villages, yet they adapted emotionally. Funerals, remembrance practices, and quiet rituals allowed grief to be processed without paralyzing daily life. Mourning coexisted with labor, laughter, and small celebrations. Life continued because it had to. Acceptance and resilience were, in many ways, survival strategies themselves. Interestingly, peasants often found meaning in small details. A bountiful harvest, a successfully mended tool, a neighbor's small act of kindness, all were moments of significance. Life wasn't heroic, but it was full of micro-triumphs. Micro-triumphs stacked day by day, season by season, year by year, and they were the invisible scaffolding of endurance. Even adversity fostered innovation. Techniques in agriculture, food preservation, water management, and tool repair evolved slowly, iteratively, across generations. Peasants didn't call it innovation, they called it life. But the cumulative effect of these small improvements increased survival rates, reduced suffering, and allowed villages to persist in a hostile world. And, perhaps most importantly, peasants understood limits. They learned when to push, when to rest, when to hide, when to negotiate. Physical, social, and psychological boundaries were constantly tested, and survival often meant knowing when to bend without breaking. That's not flashy heroism, but it's endurance of a quiet, profound sort. So as our imaginary village settles under a cold night sky, smoke curling from chimneys, livestock breathing softly in stalls, children asleep and adults exhausted but alive, consider this. Survival wasn't dramatic. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't romantic. It was repetitive, laborious, uncertain, occasionally grim, but it was human. And humans, as it turns out, are remarkably good at enduring. In the end, medieval peasants survived plagues, famine, and arbitrary lords through a combination of practical skill, social cohesion, subtle rebellion.
Part 4. Homes, Tools, Clothing, and Survival Adaptations. All right, let's settle in once again. Imagine the faint crackle of a hearth and drift slowly into the material world of medieval peasants. Because surviving plagues, famine, and the whims of lords wasn't just about work, crops, or communal cleverness. It was also about what they lived in, what they wore, and the humble inventions that made daily existence slightly more bearable. Peasant homes were, by modern standards, modest, to say the least. Often a single room of roughly 10 by 20 feet. Sometimes 2 rooms if the family had managed a few extra years without disaster. Floors were dirt, sometimes hardened or packed, occasionally sprinkled with straw to absorb moisture. Roofs were thatched, made from reeds or straw bundled tightly and layered to keep out rain. They leaked occasionally, but that was considered a normal quirk of life. Chimneys were rare. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, which left interiors smoky, but at least minimally warm during colder months. Walls were often timber-framed, with wattle and daub, sticks interwoven and plastered with mud. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't particularly durable, but it worked. Repairing the home was a constant task. Cracks appeared after heavy rains, roofs needed rethatching periodically, and a particularly windy night could undo weeks of effort. But home maintenance was part of life's rhythm, like an ongoing, unglamorous exercise in improvisation. Furniture was minimal. A rough wooden table, a few stools, and beds made from straw mattresses laid on wooden frames. Some families had chests for storing clothes or grain. Comfort was rare. Privacy was almost non-existent. Yet despite the Spartan environment, homes functioned. They protected against wind, rain, and cold. They were the base from which daily labor began and ended. And, on a small scale, they offered a space for family connection, storytelling, and quiet resilience. Tools were another critical aspect of survival. Plows, sickles, scythes, hoes, and rakes formed the backbone of agricultural work. Iron was valuable and sometimes scarce, so peasants learned to care for and repair tools carefully. Wooden handles were replaced, blades sharpened, and broken parts patched with ingenuity. A worn plow didn't just mean inconvenience, it could mean a disastrous harvest. So tools were treasured, maintained, and sometimes treated with the kind of reverent respect we usually reserve for family heirlooms. Peasants also developed small household innovations: storage bins for grain and dried goods, smokehouses for preserving meat, clay ovens for bread, and simple weaving looms were all part of the toolkit. These weren't flashy inventions, they didn't make life luxurious, but they allowed families to stretch resources, store food safely, and reduce some of the daily risks of famine. Ingenious, understated, and remarkably practical. Clothing, naturally, was functional. Most peasants wore wool or linen, rough spun and designed to last. Layering was common, particularly in colder regions. Tunics over shirts, cloaks for warmth, hoods for rain. Shoes were basic, often wooden clogs or simple leather moccasins. Color was muted, dyes were expensive, and fashion was secondary to durability. Clothing was repaired frequently, patched, and sometimes repurposed. And yet, through fraying hems and patched sleeves, families presented themselves as best they could. Function mattered. Survival mattered more. Hygiene practices were minimal but practical. Bathing was infrequent, but people used herbal washes, ash scrubbing, and communal washing spots when possible. Hair might be trimmed or combed, and fingernails cleaned in streams or with small tools. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't convenient, but it helped reduce the risk of disease and made life slightly more bearable. Fire was central to material life. Hearths provided warmth, light, and a way to cook food. Peasants learned to maintain fires efficiently, stacking wood carefully, managing airflow, and sometimes burning specific types of wood to produce the best heat or smoke. Fire was a kind of lifeline, quietly central to survival. Without it, life became dramatically more difficult, cold, and hazardous. Storage and preservation were subtle arts. Grain was kept in raised bins to avoid pests, smoked or salted meats were stored for winter, vegetables could be dried or pickled. These practices weren't formalized science. They were trial and error, passed down over generations, but they made the difference between enduring a winter or watching a family slowly starve. Even weeds could be pressed into service. Some were edible, some medicinal, and some could be used to make rudimentary cloth or cordage. Resourcefulness was part of daily life. Now, let's touch on one of the subtler aspects, mobility and transport. Peasants often relied on carts, wagons, or simple pack animals for carrying goods to market, hauling wood, or transporting water. These were basic, often rickety vehicles, but they extended survival capabilities. Villagers could sell surplus produce, trade goods, or fetch essential supplies without leaving their entire community exposed to risk. And yes, managing a stubborn donkey or a squeaky cart could feel like a full-time job in itself. Even storage of knowledge, recipes, remedies, farming practices was crucial. Most information wasn't written, of course. It existed in the heads of elders, in chants, rhymes, or repetitive instructions, like plant the beans near the fence, the beans near the fence, repeated until memorized. The consistency of generations helped preserve practices that allowed survival. Forget these small instructions, and disaster could strike, not dramatically, but slowly and reliably, through poor yields or disease. Let's also consider domestic energy. Water had to be fetched from wells or streams, firewood chopped, grains milled. Daily survival required constant movement, repetitive tasks, and often cooperation. Labor was communal, but it was relentless. There was no real leisure, not in the modern sense. Every action, however small, contributed directly to survival. Work and home life were inseparable. And yet, within this simplicity, people found comfort. Storytelling around the fire, songs while working in the fields, jokes about the Lord's foolish decrees. Even small luxuries, a fresh loaf of bread, a patch of sun in the yard, or a well-cooked stew offered tiny moments of reprieve. Material life was harsh, yes, but it was punctuated with subtle human ingenuity and quiet endurance. Finally, let's drift back to survival itself. The combination of modest homes, practical tools, durable clothing, and learned knowledge created a buffer against the constant pressures of medieval existence. Life remained difficult, fragile, and sometimes short, but it was survivable. Generations of peasants endured because of these adaptations, because of cooperation, because of subtle cleverness, and in a world dominated by famine, disease, and arbitrary lordly authority, that quiet resilience was itself remarkable. So, as you imagine the smoke curling from chimneys, the straw beds, patched tunics, and well-worn tools, you can almost feel the rhythm. Wake, labor, prepare, preserve, rest, repeat. There is a kind of poetry in it. Not heroic, not dramatic, not cinematic, but steady, reliable, human. Survival, after all, is rarely glamorous. Next, we'll slowly transition into the psychological and emotional adaptations of peasants, how hope, superstition, religion, humor, and family ties helped them endure hardships that modern people can barely imagine. And as always, we'll keep the tone soft, gentle, and slightly sarcastic, like a historian whispering you to sleep.
Part 6. Nature, Weather, and Environmental Hardships. All right, let's drift back into that straw-filled hut, the smell of smoke and damp earth blending together, and imagine the daily reality of peasants as they contended with the natural world.
Because, as it turns out, surviving medieval life wasn't just about lords, taxes, and plagues. It was also about wind, rain, frost, drought, pests, and just an all-around relentless environment. Weather was the ultimate dictator of peasant life. Crops, livestock, and even human health depended on it. A rainy spring might drown young seedlings. A scorching summer could parch fields. Frost could destroy fruit trees. Early snow could trap families indoors. And hail, well, hail was basically nature's way of mocking your careful labor. Peasants became expert observers of the sky, wind, and clouds. They learned to predict storms, rainfall, or frost, often with subtle signs: the color of the clouds, the direction of the wind, the behavior of animals. It was practical meteorology, passed down orally over generations, and crucial for survival. So, how did peasants adapt? They used simple techniques: planting in slightly elevated areas to avoid flooding, creating ditches for drainage, mulching crops to retain moisture, and rotating fields to preserve soil fertility. Irrigation was rudimentary, but effective when applied intelligently. Even small terraces or windbreaks could make a difference during extreme weather. These strategies weren't glamorous or scientific by modern standards, but they were effective, iterative, and quietly brilliant. Environmental hardships didn't stop at weather. Pests were a constant threat. Rodents, insects, fungi, and even birds could decimate crops or stored grain. Peasants developed ingenious low-tech solutions: traps, barriers, scarecrows, and strategic storage. Grain might be hung from beams to keep mice at bay. Herbs were placed among stored goods to repel insects. It wasn't foolproof, of course. Occasionally, an entire harvest would be lost to a swarm of locusts or a mold outbreak. But the ingenuity and adaptability of peasant households mitigated the worst outcomes. Water management was another key concern. Streams, wells, and cisterns were vital for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. Pollution, seasonal drying, or contamination by animals could be catastrophic. Peasants carefully selected water sources, sometimes building rudimentary channels or reservoirs. Water rules were socially enforced. Everyone knew which streams were for washing, which for drinking, and which were shared with livestock. Survival often meant managing these resources efficiently, quietly negotiating access, and teaching children the subtle rules of water use. Forests were both a resource and a danger. They provided timber, firewood, wild game, and foraged food like berries, nuts, and herbs. But forests could also harbor predators, bandits, or disease-bearing insects. Peasants navigated this duality carefully. Foraging and hunting offered nourishment, while knowledge of the forest's hazards was crucial. Paths, landmarks, and oral maps were shared, passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that people could exploit resources without walking straight into disaster. Soil fertility was another silent, persistent concern. Medieval peasants didn't have chemical fertilizers, so they relied on crop rotation, manure, and fallow periods. Fields were carefully observed and managed. If a patch of land stopped producing, it might be rested for a season or enriched with composted waste. Even livestock was integrated into the system. Animals grazed, fertilized the soil, and provided secondary resources like milk, wool, and traction for plowing. This constant, quiet interaction with the land was essential to survival. Let's consider natural disasters for a moment. Floods, droughts, storms, and occasional fires could destroy homes, livestock, and crops in an instant. Peasants didn't always survive these catastrophes, but those who did developed strategies to mitigate risk. Raised storage bins, reinforced structures, emergency food caches, and informal insurance via neighbors and kin. The lessons learned from one disaster informed preparation for the next. Experience, observation, and shared knowledge formed the backbone of environmental resilience. Climate variation over years or decades was also impactful. Medieval Europe experienced fluctuating conditions, sometimes warm and bountiful, sometimes cold and harsh. Long-term changes affected crop choice, planting schedules, and animal husbandry. Peasants adapted slowly, gradually, and pragmatically. They didn't write scientific papers about climate change, they just lived it, observed it, and adjusted. Survival demanded flexibility, patience, and a kind of quiet pragmatism that modern humans often overlook. Even small details mattered. Which crops survived certain microclimates, which trees protected homes from wind, which herbs could thrive near water sources or repel pests. These observations were meticulously recorded in memory, passed down orally and quietly honed over generations. It was slow, unglamorous, and meticulous work, but it increased the odds of survival. And in a world where famine, plague, and lords were already threats, these tiny optimizations were vital. Peasants also relied on environmental cycles for rhythm and morale. Seasons, sunrise, sunset, migration of animals, flowering of plants, all became markers of time. Even small celebrations, tied to the cycles of nature, gave structure to life. Harvest festivals, planting rituals, and seasonal feasts allowed brief relief from labor and reinforced community cohesion. Nature dictated pace and schedule, and peasants learned to synchronize their lives with it. Finally, there was a psychological aspect to all of this. Constant observation of weather, soil, water, and crops developed patience, attention to detail, and resilience. Nature could be cruel, unpredictable, and exhausting, but it was also predictable enough to plan for, and small adaptations often made enormous differences. Peasants internalized this rhythm, cultivating quiet mindfulness that we might now recognize as a kind of adaptive endurance. So, as the wind whistles through the thatched roofs and rain patters softly on the walls, imagine peasants adjusting tools, inspecting fields, hauling water, repairing homes, and quietly planning the next day. Life remained hard, uncertain, and repetitive, yet humans persisted. They survived storms, droughts, floods, and pestilence through ingenuity, observation, cooperation, and sheer stubbornness. And in that persistence, they created a rhythm of life that was surprisingly stable, given the chaos around them. As you picture that small village, smoke rising from chimneys, children tucked under straw mattresses, elders quietly giving advice, and labor continuing even in the rain, you can almost feel the subtle, unglamorous heartbeat of medieval peasant life. Survival wasn't heroic in a storybook sense, but it was steady, methodical, and profoundly human. Part 7. Festivals, Oral Traditions, and Cultural Resilience. All right, settle back. Let your mind drift over that little village and imagine the subtle rhythms that gave life texture beyond labor, survival, and hardship. Because medieval peasant life, while difficult, wasn't devoid of culture, humor, or quiet communal pleasure. Even in the midst of plagues, famine, and relentless weather, people found ways to mark time, celebrate survival, and reinforce social bonds. Let's start with festivals. These weren't the flashy parades of modern cities, but rather simple, cyclical celebrations rooted in both religion and agricultural life. Harvest festivals, for instance, were crucial. The crops were gathered, granaries filled, and people finally allowed themselves to stop working for a few hours, maybe a day. They gave thanks, shared food, sang songs, and sometimes danced in ways that were probably awkward but joyful. There might have been a bit of alcohol involved, probably ale or mead, which made dancing or storytelling slightly more entertaining. These festivals were essential breaks from the relentless grind, and they reinforced communal cohesion. Everyone had a role, everyone participated, and for a short time, survival wasn't a daily struggle. It was a shared accomplishment. Other festivals marked planting seasons, religious holy days, or local saints' days. St. George, St. Martin, or St. Michael might be celebrated with prayers, feasts, and small community games. Some festivals had very practical functions, timing labor cycles, signaling market days, or coordinating communal work projects. Others were purely social, providing rare opportunities to exchange news, gossip, and humor. In the quiet of winter, these celebrations punctuated the monotony and offered something to look forward to. Oral traditions were equally vital. Stories, proverbs, songs, and fables carried knowledge, values, and humor across generations. A child learned about which plants were edible, which rivers were safe, and which neighbors were trustworthy, all wrapped in the framework of a story. Tales of clever peasants outsmarting lords, cunning animals, or local spirits offered both instruction and entertainment. Oral tradition also reinforced social norms: generosity, caution, diligence, and courage, all quietly emphasized through repetition and narrative. Songs and music were part of this oral culture. Even a simple melody could accompany work in the fields, making labor more bearable. Singing while threshing grain or weaving baskets wasn't just for fun, it helped maintain rhythm, reduce monotony, and build community. Children learned these songs early, repeating them with slight variations, sometimes inventing their own lines. Humor, exaggeration, and irony were woven into music and storytelling, subtly mocking the absurdities of life, like the Lord's ridiculous hat, or the capriciousness of the weather, without ever becoming confrontational. Storytelling also served as emotional processing. Tales of loss, survival, famine, and plague allowed communities to articulate grief, fear, and hope without collapsing under the weight of reality. Superstitions, omens, and local legends were integrated into these narratives, sometimes instructing practical behavior, sometimes just offering a comforting explanation for otherwise inexplicable events. Peasants were in essence using culture as a survival tool, mentally, socially, and emotionally. These cultural practices created resilience over generations. Knowledge embedded in stories allowed peasants to anticipate natural hazards, manage crops, and maintain social cohesion. Festivals and rituals provided predictable markers of time, helping communities maintain routines even amidst chaos. Humor, songs, and shared narratives reinforced bonds and mitigated stress. In short, culture wasn't just decoration. It was an adaptive mechanism, quietly ensuring that people could endure a world that offered very little certainty. Let's consider intergenerational continuity. Parents, grandparents, and village elders transmitted wisdom not just through instruction, but by demonstration and shared experience. Work, storytelling, and rituals were intertwined. Young people learned to observe nature, repair tools, cook simple meals, and navigate social expectations, all embedded within the broader cultural context. Resilience wasn't abstract, it was embodied in everyday life. It was literally woven into the cloth of existence, like the patched tunics we discussed earlier. Even humor played a subtle but persistent role. Jokes, irony, and teasing allowed communities to critique authority or mock misfortune without direct confrontation. Peasants could quietly joke about a lord's ridiculous hat, or complain about taxes while still performing required labor. Humor served as a pressure valve, preventing resentment from boiling over while reinforcing social cohesion. It was understated, often dry, and rarely dramatic, but it worked. Rituals and religious observances reinforced moral and social norms. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, and feast days were opportunities for communal reflection and emotional regulation. Even small-scale practices like blessing a field before sowing or sharing bread during a festival created a sense of predictability and shared meaning. These practices weren't optional. They were integral to community identity, survival, and psychological endurance. Let's pause on adaptation over time. Villages didn't just survive one season, they survived generations. Knowledge of crops, livestock, weather patterns, and social norms accumulated gradually. Tools improved incrementally. Communication networks, both within and between villages, ensured that lessons were shared. Even small innovations, a new method of preserving grain, a slightly better plow design, or a more effective irrigation ditch, could ripple across generations, quietly increasing resilience without drama or fanfare. Isolation, surprisingly, was mitigated by cultural exchange. Markets, fairs, pilgrimages, and traveling craftsmen carried news, stories, and practical innovations from village to village. Peasants could adopt new crop varieties, tools, or techniques, integrating them into existing cultural and survival frameworks. This created a subtle network of adaptation, connecting isolated communities into a slow-moving but persistent system of shared knowledge. And finally, there was emotional endurance. Life was harsh and death was frequent, but social and cultural practices allowed communities to absorb loss, maintain cohesion, and retain hope. Humor, storytelling, ritual, and festival provided coping mechanisms. Family structures offered support. Knowledge of work, tools, and the environment offered control over at least some aspects of life. Peasants endured not through heroism or dramatic victories, but through the quiet accumulation of adaptive practices, physical, social, and psychological. So, as the village settles into night, smoke rising from chimneys, animals resting in stalls, and children dreaming under straw mattresses, picture the subtle pulse of culture that keeps everything in motion. Festivals, songs, stories, rituals, they are the hidden scaffolding that allows communities to survive plagues, famine, arbitrary lords, and capricious weather. Life remained hard, repetitive, and sometimes autumn, but it was human, enduring, and quietly remarkable. Part 8. Reflections on Endurance and the Quiet Legacy of Peasant Life. All right, let's settle into our imaginary village one last time. Smoke curling from chimneys, the occasional bark of a dog, the distant lowing of cows, and the faint creak of a wind-blown gate. We've walked through homes, tools, clothing, plagues, lords, environmental hardships, festivals, stories, and social bonds. And now, as the night stretches long and quiet, let's reflect on the larger picture, the quiet, persistent endurance that defined medieval peasant life. If there's one thing to understand, it's this: survival was an art, not glamorous, not dramatic, not recorded in epic poetry, but profoundly human. Every day required a careful balancing act, tending crops, feeding livestock, repairing homes, preserving food, negotiating social dynamics, observing weather, and maintaining emotional equilibrium. Peasants rarely had control over lords, plagues, or storms. What they could control, however, was how they responded, through labor, ingenuity, cooperation, humor, and ritual. Work was omnipresent, yet it was also structured. Seasonal cycles provided rhythm: spring planting, summer maintenance, autumn harvest, winter repair and preparation. The calendar itself was a survival tool. Festivals punctuated labor with communal relief. Rituals marked transitions and gave meaning to repetition. Even minor successes, a patch of grain surviving pests, a roof repaired before a storm, a child thriving, provided psychological reinforcement. Life, while harsh, was patterned, and pattern is comforting. The social dimension was equally vital. Family, neighbors, and kin networks provided labor, knowledge, and emotional support. Gossip, storytelling, and humor reinforced cohesion and mitigated stress. Minor acts of defiance, hiding grain, delaying labor, exaggerating losses, allowed subtle resistance without risking total ruin. Communities were microcosms of resilience, quietly maintaining structure despite external pressures. Material adaptations, from simple tools to modest homes, weren't signs of poverty alone. They were evidence of practical ingenuity. Preservation of food, rotation of fields, and water management were daily exercises in applied problem-solving. Environmental awareness, reading clouds, observing animal behavior, understanding soil and microclimates was an ongoing science practiced without theory, experiment, or lab coats. The peasant's wisdom was empirical, subtle, and passed down through generations. Psychological resilience was embedded in routine, ritual, humor, and storytelling. Oral tradition wasn't just entertainment. It conveyed knowledge, reinforced norms, and allowed communities to process grief, fear, and uncertainty. Humor softened hardship. Festivals punctuated monotony, and religious observances offered structure and meaning. Even superstition provided psychological scaffolding. Life could be unpredictable, cruel, and exhausting, but these practices allowed people to endure without collapsing under pressure. And then there was endurance itself. Peasants faced plagues, famine, environmental hazards, and arbitrary authority, but they survived, year after year, generation after generation. Their heroism was quiet, often invisible, and rarely celebrated, yet it was real. Steady labor, careful observation, adaptive innovation, social cohesion, and cultural continuity created a foundation for survival. Without these cumulative practices, humanity itself might have faltered during the dark centuries of medieval uncertainty. It's worth reflecting on scale. The peasants we've imagined were just one part of a vast social structure. Lords, knights, clergy, and monarchs often dominate history books with dramatic narratives, but it was the labor, creativity, and endurance of ordinary people that sustained the economy, maintained villages, and preserved human life. Their work underpinned everything else. It was unglamorous, repetitive, and quiet, but indispensable. Even adversity contributed to resilience. Famine taught careful preservation. Plague encouraged hygiene, quarantine, and adaptive practices. Harsh weather honed observation, ingenuity, and timing. Authority inspired subtle negotiation and resistance. Hardship shaped rhythm, awareness, and creativity. Peasants adapted slowly, gradually, and pragmatically, creating a culture of endurance that survived in memory, practice, and oral tradition. So consider finally the subtle poetry of everyday life. Sunrise over plowed fields, the creak of wooden carts, the soft chatter of neighbors sharing news, the laughter of children despite patched clothes and empty stomachs. Life was difficult, uncertain, and often grim, but it was filled with small triumphs, quiet joys, and enduring rhythms. Endurance itself was a form of beauty. The resilience of ordinary humans created continuity, culture, and community in a world where fragility was constant. So, as the village falls silent under the night sky, imagine the subtle pulse of life continuing, quietly, relentlessly. Smoke rises from chimneys, animals rest, and people sleep, exhausted but alive. Tomorrow, labor resumes. Fields are tended, animals fed, homes repaired, stories told, songs sung. The rhythm continues, unbroken by drama, but sustained by countless small acts of intelligence, cooperation, and endurance. And that is the legacy of medieval peasant life. Quiet, uncelebrated, persistent, and profoundly human.
Not glamorous, not heroic in the traditional sense, but heroic in its own understated way. They survived, adapted, and passed on knowledge, culture, and resilience to future generations. Their story is a testament to the human capacity for endurance, creativity, and community in the face of relentless adversity. So as you let your mind drift, imagine the small village bathed in moonlight, smoke curling from chimneys, the soft breathing of animals, and the faint murmur of sleeping families. Life endures, rhythmically, patiently, and subtly. And as you slowly close your eyes, take comfort in the enduring human spirit, the same spirit that allowed ordinary people to survive plagues, famines, storms, and the whims of lords.
Part 9. Migration, Trade, and External Influences. All right, let's slowly drift back into the village. But this time, imagine the world beyond the fields, the forests, and the immediate horizon. Medieval peasants were remarkably tied to their local environment, yet they were not entirely isolated. Migration, trade, and occasional interaction with outsiders played subtle but significant roles in their survival, even if these interactions were often brief, inconvenient, or mildly risky. Migration wasn't necessarily dramatic. Most peasants didn't pack up and walk across continents. Instead, mobility was seasonal or opportunistic. Young adults might leave temporarily to work as laborers on larger estates, monasteries, or in nearby towns. Apprenticeships offered skills and modest wages. Some families relocated after crop failures, floods, or disputes with local lords. These movements were cautious and calculated. Risk was balanced against reward, and in practice, migration allowed peasants to access resources, knowledge, or temporary relief from overworked fields and constrained village economies. Trade was similarly understated but essential. Surplus grain, dairy, wool, or handcrafted items could be sold or exchanged at local markets or fairs. Trade brought not only material goods, but also ideas, new tools, crop varieties, or techniques. It was also a social conduit. Peasants learned gossip, news, and practical advice from traveling merchants. Markets became a subtle node of survival knowledge, a place where innovation, rumor, and barter intertwined in ways that quietly supported village life. Even small-scale trade had risks. Theft, overpricing by traveling merchants, or accidents on muddy roads could offset gains. And yet the potential benefits outweighed the dangers, at least occasionally. Peasants became adept at negotiation, observation, and calculation, skills that were not just economic, but also survival-oriented. In a world where a failed harvest could mean famine, every loaf, every sack of grain, every trading opportunity counted. External influences also shaped peasant resilience. Neighboring villages, wandering monks, itinerant craftsmen, and local officials introduced new techniques, knowledge, and sometimes minor challenges. A traveling blacksmith could repair tools or introduce new plow designs. A wandering herbalist might share remedies for common ailments. Even the occasional noble inspection brought knowledge of what was expected, or at least how to subtly circumvent impossible demands. Peasants absorbed, adapted, and integrated these external inputs with a practical, cautious mindset. Migration and trade also provided psychological relief. Meeting outsiders, learning a few new skills, or observing slightly different ways of doing things expanded peasant horizons. It reminded villagers that there was a world beyond their fields, their forests, and their immediate horizon. This knowledge, however modest, fostered flexibility, adaptation, and a quiet sense of agency. Even temporary exposure to the wider world had long-term effects on survival strategies. Environmental knowledge sometimes traveled this way too. Techniques for irrigation, soil enrichment, or pest control could spread between villages or regions. A clever variation of crop rotation or a new seed type might quietly increase resilience for generations. And just as importantly, exposure to external methods allowed peasants to compare, test, and refine local practices without dramatically altering their daily rhythm. Incremental improvements, passed quietly between neighbors and outsiders, compounded over decades. Religion and pilgrimage also played a role in external influence. Visiting a shrine, monastery, or holy site could provide access to medical knowledge, seed stock, or tools. Pilgrimage was also social, a rare opportunity to connect with others outside the village and share experiences, stories, and advice. Peasants returned with subtle innovations, small gifts, or new perspectives, quietly integrating them into village life. The world beyond the village was not always kind, but it was occasionally instructive. Finally, consider the mental aspect of these interactions. Exposure to the wider world reinforced practical problem-solving and observation. Seeing a better irrigation ditch or a sturdier cart somewhere else offered lessons in efficiency. Hearing stories of distant hardships and successes allowed villagers to mentally rehearse coping strategies. Even brief travel or trade enriched their adaptive toolkit. Survival, after all, was as much about knowledge and anticipation as it was about labor and endurance. In conclusion, migration, trade, and external influences acted like a subtle current beneath peasant life. They did not overturn the daily rhythm of toil, nor did they dramatically alter the quiet heroism of survival, but they added depth, flexibility, and incremental advantage. They were part of the invisible scaffolding of endurance, practical, cumulative, and remarkably effective over time. So, as you picture the village at dusk, with smoke curling from chimneys, children whispering bedtime stories, and adults quietly repairing tools, imagine the world beyond the horizon. Occasionally, a traveler passes through, a merchant arrives at the market, or a young apprentice returns from a distant estate. Small, subtle interactions, almost invisible in the day-to-day, ripple through the village, reinforcing survival in ways that are easy to overlook. Tomorrow, as always, life continues, plowing, tending animals, cooking, mending, and observing the world. And quietly, invisibly, these small connections to the wider world ensure that human life endures, persists, and adapts, season after season, generation after generation.
Part 10. Medicine, herbal remedies, and informal healthcare. All right. Settle back and picture the dim interior of a medieval peasant hut, the faint scent of smoke mingling with herbs drying from beams overhead. Life was harsh, unpredictable, and sometimes unpleasantly itchy or feverish. Disease, injury, and chronic pain were constant companions. And yet peasants survived, not because doctors were abundant, or magic cures were reliable, but because they developed a practical, empirically grounded system of informal healthcare. Let's start with illness. Common ailments ranged from minor colds and digestive issues to fevers, infections, and injuries from labor. Plagues and epidemics could devastate entire villages, yet daily illnesses were managed with ingenuity. Herbal remedies were the foundation. Chamomile, sage, mint, and yarrow were among the most commonly used herbs, each chosen for particular properties: calming, antiseptic, or anti-inflammatory effects. Knowledge of these plants was transmitted orally, sometimes alongside songs or rhymes, to help remember proper preparation and dosage. A key principle was observation. Peasants noticed patterns, which herbs soothed which symptoms, which treatments seemed to coincide with recovery, and which foods or behaviors improved outcomes. Scientific rigor, as we know it, didn't exist, but empirical observation certainly did.
Over generations, communities accumulated a practical knowledge base that was quietly effective. A poultice of mashed herbs for a wound, a brewed tea for a stomach pain, or a compress for swelling were all small interventions that improved chances of survival. Midwives played a vital role in village medicine. Pregnancy, childbirth, and infant care were high-risk endeavors. Experienced midwives, often older women in the community, provided guidance on prenatal care, birthing techniques, and postpartum recovery. Herbs like fennel, raspberry leaf, and chamomile were used to ease labor, prevent infection, or promote lactation. Midwives also served as custodians of reproductive knowledge, passing down practical wisdom about nutrition, hygiene, and childcare in ways that textbooks or lords rarely did. Injury management was similarly practical. Cuts, bruises, sprains, and fractures were addressed with bandages, splints, poultices, or simply rest. Alcohol, vinegar, and honey sometimes served as antiseptics. Bones were immobilized with wooden splints, tied with cloth or leather straps. Infection was a constant concern, but even small interventions could reduce risk and improve outcomes. Peasants learned quickly. A well-wrapped wound could mean the difference between returning to work or succumbing to complications. Nutrition was also seen as medicine. Seasonal diets rooted in grains, legumes, vegetables, and limited animal products provided essential sustenance. Certain foods were believed to treat specific ailments: garlic for infections, onions for digestive complaints, or milk for general strength. Knowledge of edible plants, wild herbs, and nutritious roots supplemented diets, especially in lean years. Even minor nutritional wisdom contributed quietly but significantly to survival. Some villagers had access to local apothecaries or traveling healers, but these encounters were rare, expensive, or unreliable. Most care was domestic. Families relied on collective knowledge, sharing remedies, and watching each other for symptoms. The oral transmission of medical knowledge was carefully preserved. A failed remedy was noted, a successful one repeated, and practices refined over decades. This was low-tech, informal epidemiology, passed generation to generation. Mental health, too, was addressed in subtle ways. Anxiety, grief, and stress were managed through storytelling, humor, social bonds, and ritual. Work itself was a stabilizing force. Rhythm, repetition, and physical activity provided psychological structure. Festivals, communal meals, and prayer offered brief relief and reassurance. The human mind, much like the body, adapted to the pressures of survival through social, cultural, and behavioral mechanisms. Even preventive measures were practiced. Cleaning floors, changing bedding, washing hands before meals or handling children, and managing waste were all part of an informal health regimen. Smoke from the hearth sometimes had antiseptic effects, and herbs were used to repel insects and vermin. Peasants understood, through observation and experience, that cleanliness and environmental management reduced risk, even if their explanations were couched in superstition or tradition. Disease outbreaks were terrifying, but also instructive. Villagers developed isolation practices. Sick family members were separated when possible, beds and blankets burned or washed, and food handled carefully. Oral knowledge guided decisions: which herbs might ease fever, which rituals might protect the community, and which behaviors to avoid. Survival often depended on quick thinking, practical improvisation, and adherence to tried and true practices rather than divine intervention or external medical authority. Injuries during labor, farming, or domestic work were constant. Handling animals, chopping wood, or navigating slippery paths could easily result in accidents. Quick response, basic first aid, and communal support were essential. The village operated as an informal health network. Experience, observation, and empathy guided interventions. Even without formal medical training, villagers could reduce suffering and improve outcomes through collective care. Let's also touch on longevity and cumulative knowledge. Villagers who survived childhood diseases, accidents, and environmental hazards often lived into middle age or beyond. These individuals became repositories of knowledge, herbal, practical, and social, ensuring continuity of care. Elders instructed youth in remedies, rituals, and preventive strategies, embedding medical practice into the fabric of daily life. Knowledge was both practical and cultural, a subtle yet essential survival mechanism. Finally, consider the peculiar comfort of ritualized care. Lighting candles, whispering prayers, applying poultices, and repeating prescribed songs or incantations created structure and hope. Even if the cure wasn't miraculous, the process itself fostered resilience, reinforcing the belief that effort mattered, that survival was possible, and that the community cared. Medicine in this context was as much about confidence, routine, and social cohesion as it was about actual physical outcomes. So, as you picture a peasant family tending to a sick child, mixing herbs for a fever, wrapping a splint around a fractured arm, or quietly whispering prayers while watching over the vulnerable, you see the quiet, persistent ingenuity that sustained life. Survival was never guaranteed. Pain, disease, and death were constant companions. Yet through observation, communal knowledge, ritual, humor, and practical adaptation, villagers endured. Life was difficult, fragile, and repetitive, but it was lived with intelligence, care, and quiet resilience.
Part 11. Childhood, Education, and Apprenticeship in Peasant Life. All right, let's drift back into the village at dawn, with sunlight filtering over plowed fields, the smell of smoke and damp earth, and children beginning their day. Childhood in the medieval village was, well, let's just say it was busy. There wasn't much time for idle play, but there was plenty of learning, mostly through observation, imitation, and hands-on experience. From the moment they could walk, children were gradually integrated into the rhythms of labor. Toddlers might carry small bundles of firewood or fetch water, learning responsibility early. By the age of 6 or 7, they were helping in the fields, tending animals, or assisting with household chores. Education wasn't about books or formal instruction, it was about survival skills. Knowing how to milk a goat, repair a roof, plant a seed, or gather herbs could mean the difference between life and death. Observation was the first teacher. Children watched parents and neighbors carefully, imitating tasks and gradually acquiring proficiency. Mistakes were corrected gently, or sometimes with a quiet sigh or raised eyebrow. Humor often accompanied these corrections. A child spilling a bucket of water might be met with a wry comment about being an apprentice to clumsiness, reinforcing lessons without destroying morale. Repetition, observation, and gentle correction were the building blocks of practical education. Apprenticeship extended beyond the family. Older children or young adults sometimes worked under the guidance of more experienced villagers, learning specialized skills. Carpentry, blacksmithing, weaving, and animal husbandry were taught through demonstration, repetition, and small responsibilities. Mistakes were tolerated insofar as they didn't cause ruin. Broken tools or minor injuries were part of the learning process. Over time, competence built confidence, independence, and a sense of agency. Stories, songs, and oral tradition were also educational. Through narratives, children learned about morality, local history, practical skills, and social norms. A fable about a clever farmer might subtly teach observation of nature, resourcefulness, or caution around dangerous animals. Songs might encode knowledge of planting cycles, weather signs, or seasonal festivals. Learning was embedded in culture, quietly transmitting survival skills alongside entertainment. Physical activity was integral.
Children ran errands, gathered wood, herded animals, and played games that mimicked adult labor. Strength, endurance, and coordination developed naturally through daily tasks. Play was rarely separate from work. It was intertwined with responsibility. And yet, small moments of humor, teasing, and imaginative play offered psychological relief and reinforced social bonds. Learning to endure, adapt, and cooperate started early. Gender roles shaped childhood education. Girls typically learned domestic skills, cooking, weaving, spinning, childcare, and maintaining the household. Boys learned fieldwork, tool use, animal care, and occasional trade skills. Exceptions existed, of course. Skills could be fluid depending on need, but generally, education was practical, gendered, and closely tied to the village economy. This system ensured that every child, regardless of sex, acquired a useful skill set for survival. Childhood mortality was high, which shaped both education and emotional life. Parents and communities acknowledged risk, but this didn't stop affection or investment in skill building. Emotional resilience was cultivated through repeated exposure to minor hardships, observation of adult problem-solving, and participation in communal labor. Children learned early that life was difficult but manageable with knowledge, cooperation, and adaptability. Festivals, storytelling, and ritual punctuated learning. Religious observances, seasonal festivals, and market days offered opportunities for socialization, moral instruction, and reinforcement of communal identity. Children participated actively, carrying offerings, singing, or helping prepare meals, absorbing cultural practices while observing the rhythm of adult life. Even small roles in festivals taught responsibility, timing, and coordination. Informal mentorship extended to problem-solving. Older children guided younger ones. Experienced villagers coached apprentices. Even minor errors, spilling grain, misplacing tools, or misjudging a herding route, were turned into lessons. The culture of observation, correction, and incremental mastery created a robust framework for practical education. Learning was slow, steady, and embedded in real-life experience. Let's not forget humor. Even in the midst of work, teasing, playful rivalry, and storytelling help children process stress, understand social hierarchies, and develop emotional flexibility. Humor was subtle, dry, and often ironic. A child tripping over a goat might be gently mocked while simultaneously learning caution. Laughter was not frivolous, it was a tool for endurance, teaching perspective alongside practical skill. Finally, apprenticeship prepared children for adulthood. By mid-adolescence, most young people were competent in essential survival skills. They could manage household duties, tend fields, care for animals, and participate fully in village life. Skills, social knowledge, and psychological resilience had been cultivated through a combination of observation, repetition, mentorship, ritual, and play. The cumulative effect was remarkable. Ordinary children became competent, resourceful adults capable of enduring a world that offered little certainty. So, as you imagine children navigating the village, helping, observing, playing, learning, and laughing quietly, you see the slow, steady cultivation of resilience. Education wasn't about achievement, exams, or recognition. It was about survival, competence, and continuity. By the time they reached adulthood, peasant children had absorbed a lifetime of practical wisdom, embedded in labor, social interaction, and cultural practice. Tomorrow, the rhythm continues. Children become adults. Adults continue labor. Skills are refined, knowledge transmitted, and the quiet pulse of village life endures. Learning is never separate from living. It is life itself. And in this slow, repetitive, unglamorous process, medieval peasant communities ensured continuity, survival, and the persistence of human ingenuity. Part 12. Gender, Family Dynamics, and Marriage in Peasant Communities. All right, let's gently return to our quiet village, where smoke rises lazily from chimneys, chickens peck near the well, and adults quietly prepare for another day of work. Among the many threads of survival, labor, knowledge, and adaptation, family and gender dynamics played an equally central, though subtle, role. Life was hard, and the structure of the household was essential to enduring it. Family units were functional, pragmatic, and remarkably resilient. Households were often extended. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes aunts, uncles, or cousins lived together. This arrangement provided labor, oversight, childcare, and a built-in support system. Grandparents and older adults transmitted knowledge about crops, herbs, rituals, and local lore. Children learned practical skills and social norms through observation and participation. Each family member had a role, and survival depended on fulfilling it reliably. Gender shaped these roles in predictable ways, though the boundaries were not always rigid. Men typically handled heavier labor, plowing, logging, carrying water, tending large livestock. Women managed the household, smaller livestock, gardens, food preparation, and child rearing. And yet flexibility was essential. In times of scarcity or crisis, everyone pitched in where needed. Men milked goats, women repaired roofs, children helped haul firewood. Survival demanded versatility. Marriage was both a personal and economic arrangement. Love existed, though it often took a back seat to practicality. Marriages consolidated resources, labor, and social connections. Young adults married to strengthen alliances, ensure workforce continuity, and provide mutual support. Dowries were modest, sometimes consisting of household goods, animals, or a small parcel of land. The arrangement was less about romance and more about sustaining life. And yet, human emotion persisted quietly, intertwined with the practical framework. Couples found companionship, shared humor, and, occasionally, affection amidst their daily labor. Parenting was intensive. Children were both laborers and learners. From an early age, they contributed to household survival, and parents guided them through observation, instruction, and gentle correction. Harshness was often pragmatic rather than punitive, teaching children to handle tools safely, tend animals responsibly, or navigate social expectations. Parents modeled endurance, resilience, and problem-solving, and children absorbed these lessons slowly, incrementally, and quietly. Extended family networks reinforced survival. Cousins, siblings, and neighbors provided additional labor, shared food, and offered emotional support. Childcare was distributed. When a parent worked the fields, grandparents or older siblings often supervised younger children. During illness, the household pooled resources to maintain care. This network was essential. Survival depended on cooperation, shared knowledge, and the ability to respond collectively to crises like crop failure, disease, or extreme weather. Women's labor was especially central, though often underappreciated in historical accounts. In addition to domestic work, women managed gardens, small livestock, food preservation, herbal remedies, and social organization. They coordinated festival preparations, guided apprenticeships for girls, and served as midwives and caregivers. In practical terms, women maintained the social and material infrastructure that allowed the household to endure. Without their quiet, continuous labor, survival would have been much more precarious. Men's roles, while more visibly physical, were equally essential. Plowing, transporting goods, constructing shelters, and tending large animals ensured the village's subsistence economy functioned. Men also participated in communal labor, digging irrigation ditches, repairing roads, or assisting in harvests. Their work complemented women's, forming an integrated system where survival required cooperation, coordination, and shared responsibility. Marriage also structured social networks. Kinship ties linked households across villages, providing mutual aid in times of famine, labor shortages, or disease outbreaks. These networks ensured that resources, knowledge, and labor could be mobilized quickly when needed. Social cohesion, maintained through marriage alliances and family loyalty, was as crucial to survival as crops or livestock. Emotional bonds within families, though often understated, were vital. Affection, humor, and shared storytelling helped mitigate stress and foster resilience. Children observed these interactions, learning not just practical skills, but emotional coping mechanisms. Even in a world dominated by labor and scarcity, small gestures, a shared meal, a whispered story, or a quiet joke reinforced bonds and nurtured endurance. Finally, let's consider inheritance and succession. Property, tools, and knowledge passed gradually through families. Elders guided youth in managing household resources, tending land, and maintaining livestock. Knowledge was cumulative. Each generation built on the practical and cultural lessons of the previous one. This continuity ensured that survival strategies persisted over decades, quietly reinforcing resilience. So, as you imagine the village at dawn, with couples quietly discussing daily tasks, children learning from elders, and extended family coordinating labor, you see the subtle architecture of survival. Marriage, gender roles, and family dynamics were not glamorous or dramatic. They were functional, adaptive, and essential. Life depended on it, quietly, day after day, season after season. Tomorrow, the rhythm continues. Labor, learning, care, and adaptation all interweave. Families sustain communities, communities sustain life. And in this slow, persistent cycle, medieval peasants maintained not just survival, but a quiet, resilient civilization built on observation, cooperation, and human ingenuity.
Part 13. Ritual, Superstition, and Folk Belief in Peasant Survival. All right, let's drift once again into the quiet medieval village where smoke curls lazily from chimneys, chickens cluck softly near the well, and the occasional goat wanders past a patch garden. Among the many practical strategies for survival, labor, family cohesion, observation, and learning, another layer quietly underpinned peasant life: ritual, superstition, and folk belief. Now, before we get too serious, let's clarify. Superstition was not mere foolishness. It was pragmatic, adaptive, and often informed by careful observation of the environment, behavior, and social patterns. And rituals? They were the structured counterpart to superstition, a way of giving rhythm, meaning, and predictability to a world that was otherwise chaotic, exhausting, and occasionally deadly. Take, for instance, the myriad ways villagers interacted with the unseen. Small charms, blessed objects, or whispered prayers were used to protect crops, livestock, and family members. A sprig of rosemary above the door might be intended to ward off disease. A small coin buried in the foundation of a new hut could ensure stability. These actions were part superstition, part ritual, and part practical psychology. They offered a sense of control, however symbolic, in a world where plagues, famine, and bad weather made control tenuous at best. Animal behavior was another source of belief. Peasants noticed subtle signs, the flight of birds, the behavior of livestock, or the appearance of insects. These observations were codified into folk wisdom. A crow circling above the village might indicate rain. A
cow lying down repeatedly could foreshadow storm or disease. Over generations, these omens became integrated into daily practice. Observation and superstition blended seamlessly, creating a system that was both culturally rich and subtly adaptive. Rituals marked time, transitions, and labor cycles. Before planting, a small blessing of the fields might be performed. Harvests were accompanied by feasts, prayers, and offerings, ensuring not just celebration, but a psychologically reassuring sense of completion. Even minor rituals, lighting candles before meals, invoking protection before crossing a river, or leaving small offerings for forest spirits, helped villagers manage uncertainty and maintain emotional equilibrium. Folk medicine intersected with superstition. Certain herbs were believed to have magical properties in addition to practical uses. Yarrow might be applied to wounds to staunch bleeding and protect against evil spirits. Garlic might be used to repel pests and ward off illness. Teas, poultices, and charms often combined empirical observation with symbolic action. Even if the effect was partly placebo, it reinforced the peasant's sense of agency in controlling the uncontrollable. Seasonal festivals carried layers of ritual and belief. Pagan remnants mingled with Christian observances. Bonfires, processions, and masked dances marked solstices, equinoxes, and harvests. These events reinforced social cohesion, structured labor cycles, and allowed communities to collectively negotiate with forces beyond their control, whether divine, spiritual, or simply the weather. Participation was both cultural and functional, embedding shared meaning into daily survival practices. Superstition also governed interpersonal behavior. Certain days were considered lucky or unlucky for planting, travel, or trade. Breaking minor taboos could invite social disapproval or misfortune. These beliefs enforced order subtly, guiding behavior without overt coercion. In essence, superstition functioned as a social regulator as well as a psychological tool. It helped people anticipate risk and organize behavior in the absence of formal institutions or scientific knowledge. Even domestic spaces were influenced by ritual. Beds, hearths, and thresholds were sites of symbolic action. A broom placed strategically could ward off misfortune. Water sprinkled at thresholds might protect the household from evil spirits or disease. These actions created a sense of stability, rhythm, and control, reinforcing the quiet psychological scaffolding that allowed families to persist in the face of adversity. Children were socialized into these beliefs early. Stories about spirits, protective charms, or unlucky days were woven into play and instruction. Songs and rhymes encoded practical advice alongside cultural norms, creating an integrated system of learning, adaptation, and moral guidance. Observation, imitation, and ritual practice prepared the next generation for survival in a world that was unpredictable and often unforgiving. Humor and irony played a subtle role here too. Peasants might mock their own superstitions, joke about bad omens, or share stories of misadventures caused by ignoring minor rituals. Humor acted as a release valve, allowing communities to acknowledge the absurdity of life's uncertainties without undermining the functional purpose of belief. Dry, understated, and socially shared, it reinforced cohesion while preventing despair. Ultimately, ritual, superstition, and folk belief were integral to the peasant survival toolkit. They weren't frivolous or irrational, they were adaptive. They provided structure, meaning, and psychological relief. They guided observation and decision-making. They reinforced social cohesion and transmitted practical knowledge. In a world where mortality, weather, and authority were unpredictable, these practices quietly enhanced resilience. So, as you imagine the village at dusk, with smoke rising, animals settling, families whispering prayers, children repeating charms, and elders recounting old omens, you can see how the unseen and symbolic aspects of life were as essential as labor, diet, or practical knowledge. They wove together the material and cultural threads of survival, creating a coherent, enduring framework for life in a challenging and often unpredictable environment. Tomorrow, as always, labor continues. Fields are tended, animals cared for, tools repaired, and rituals observed. And quietly, subtly, the combined forces of observation, superstition, ritual, and practical knowledge ensure that life endures generation after generation. Survival in the medieval village was never glamorous, dramatic, or heroic in the conventional sense, but it was intelligent, adaptive, and profoundly human.
Part 14. Food, Diet, and Preservation Techniques. All right, let's return to the village at dawn, when the smell of smoke mingles with damp earth and the faint aroma of porridge or bread being prepared drifts from the kitchen. Food was central to peasant survival. Not the gourmet meals of nobility, not extravagant feasts, but practical, modest sustenance that fueled labor, maintained health, and allowed communities to endure harsh conditions. The peasant diet was largely dictated by availability, seasonality, and economic constraints. Grains, wheat, rye, barley, and oats formed the foundation. Bread, porridge, and gruel were staples, often consumed with a bit of salt, occasionally with milk or butter, if livestock were available. Grain was not only food, but a storage medium. Properly dried and stored, it could last through harsh winters, providing a predictable source of energy. Legumes, such as peas, beans, and lentils, supplemented the diet, offering protein at minimal cost. Vegetables were grown in small garden plots, rotated carefully to maintain soil fertility. Onions, leeks, cabbages, and root vegetables were common. Seasonal fruits, apples, berries, plums, added variety and essential nutrients when available. The diet was plain, repetitive, and sometimes monotonous, but it provided the basics of caloric and nutritional needs. Animal products were limited, but vital. Chickens provided eggs, goats or cows offered milk, and pigs or sheep occasionally provided meat, especially during festivals or special occasions. Preservation was critical. Salted, smoked, or dried meat could be stored for weeks or months. Dairy products like cheese were durable and nutritionally dense, making them essential staples in lean periods. Preservation techniques were diverse and carefully applied. Grain was dried, stored in sacks or bins, and sometimes fumigated with smoke to prevent pests. Vegetables were pickled, fermented, or stored in root cellars. Meat was salted, smoked, or air-dried. Fish, where available, was similarly treated. Preservation was not optional, it was central to survival. A failed storage system could mean hunger, illness, or the slowed decline of household energy reserves. Cooking techniques were simple but effective. Boiling, baking, roasting, and occasionally frying were common. Pots and cauldrons hung over the hearth, bread was baked in communal ovens, and simple stoves or fire pits provided heat for cooking. Fuel efficiency mattered. Wood was collected carefully, and hearths were maintained to balance warmth, cooking, and safety. Every meal was a product of labor, planning, and adaptation. Seasonal adjustments were constant. Spring offered fresh greens and herbs. Summer provided fruits and vegetables as well as opportunities to store surplus. Autumn harvests required intense activity, gathering, drying, fermenting, and storing enough food to last winter. Winter meals relied heavily on preserved foods, grains, salted meat, root vegetables, and dairy products. Planning, knowledge, and careful labor ensured that families could endure the lean months without starvation.
Herbs and spices, when available, served dual purposes: flavor and health. Local herbs, sage, rosemary, thyme, mint, were cultivated or gathered from the wild. They added flavor, preserved food, and sometimes had medicinal effects. Spices from distant markets were rare, expensive, and reserved for special occasions. Even in modest quantities, they elevated simple meals, offering psychological comfort and a sense of abundance. Community cooperation played a role in food security. Villages often shared resources during lean years, collaborated on harvesting, and assisted neighbors in preserving surplus. Markets and fairs allowed for barter or purchase of missing staples. Knowledge of local wild edibles, mushrooms, berries, nuts, and herbs provided additional flexibility. Survival depended on careful observation, timing, and methodical labor, as much as on sheer physical labor. Even humor appeared at mealtimes. A burnt loaf or overly thin porridge might elicit wry remarks. Jokes about a neighbor's overcooked vegetables or a child's clumsy attempts to crack eggs were common. Humor was subtle, reinforcing social bonds and providing relief from the monotony and scarcity that defined daily meals. Laughter was food for the spirit, supplementing food for the body. Diet and preservation also shaped rhythms of life. Labor schedules followed agricultural cycles. Harvest festivals marked abundance, winter meals required careful rationing, and spring planting relied on stored seed grain. Knowledge of how to sustain energy, maintain health, and manage food stores was embedded in daily routines. Survival was intimately connected to observation, timing, and methodical labor. Finally, consider the psychological component. The act of preparing, preserving, and sharing food reinforced family cohesion and community resilience. A warm meal after a day of labor offered nourishment and comfort. Sharing surplus strengthened social bonds. Even small successes, a well-stored sack of grain, a fresh loaf of bread, or a jar of pickled vegetables, reinforced competence, hope, and endurance. Food was practical, necessary, and deeply tied to this quiet psychology of survival. So, as you imagine the village at dusk, with families preparing meals, children fetching water, and the aroma of bread or porridge drifting through the air, you can see how food and preservation practices were more than sustenance. They were an essential component of survival strategy, culture, and human resilience. Meals were modest, repetitive, and labor-intensive, but they kept bodies alive, minds alert, and communities connected.
Part 15. Clothing, Textiles, and Material Culture in Peasant Survival. All right, let's slowly return to the village, imagining the early morning mist hovering over modest huts and fields. As we think about survival, food and labor are obvious concerns, but so is clothing. Not silk robes or velvet doublets, but practical garments that allowed peasants to work, endure the elements, and survive in a world where weather, wear, and accidents were constant companions. Peasant clothing was simple, durable, and designed for utility. Linen and wool were the primary fabrics. Linen, harvested from flax, provided light, breathable garments suitable for warmer months. Wool, spun from sheep, offered warmth and protection during cold seasons. Clothing was heavy on practicality, light on fashion. And yet subtle elements, color, embroidery, or patchwork, revealed personality, family identity, or resourcefulness. Of course, peasants couldn't afford silk or velvet, but even modest patches could display a small sense of pride. Most garments were homemade. Women typically spun flax into linen or wool into yarn, then wove,
cut, and sewed it into clothing. This labor-intensive process was essential for survival. A torn shirt or worn-out pair of trousers could not simply be replaced at the local shop. Maintenance was constant, mending holes, reinforcing seams, and repurposing old garments. Creativity and practicality merged. A patched tunic, while visually humble, was a triumph of resource management. Shoes, when available, were equally practical. Simple leather or wooden-soled footwear protected the feet during labor. Some peasants went barefoot when necessary, toughening their soles gradually. Boots, clogs, or simple sandals were crafted from locally available materials, providing function over fashion. Cold, wet, or rough terrain made foot protection a matter of survival rather than style. Clothing also provided protection from environmental hazards. Wool and layered garments offered insulation against cold, rain, and wind. Hoods, cloaks, and hats shielded heads from sun and frost. Thick sleeves protected arms during fieldwork. Even modest garments were carefully considered in terms of function, reflecting the practical intelligence of peasant life. Textiles were not limited to clothing. Blankets, bedding, and bags were equally important. Straw-stuffed mattresses, woolen blankets, and linen sheets provided warmth and comfort in harsh winters. Storage sacks, often woven from leftover fabric, allowed preservation of grain, herbs, and other essentials. Each textile object carried practical purpose, cultural significance, and occasional aesthetic consideration. Survival was as much about making, maintaining, and repairing these items as it was about food or labor. Colors were mostly muted, derived from natural dyes: browns, ochres, grays, and muted greens. Brighter colors existed, but were rare and reserved for festivals or ceremonial occasions. Subtle decoration, embroidered borders, or patched patterns offered individuality while undermining practicality. A peasant could express ingenuity and taste while maintaining durability, reinforcing identity and family heritage. Seasonal adjustments were critical. Lightweight linen tunics were common in summer, wool cloaks and layered garments in winter. Gloves or mittens were often homemade from scraps. Hats, hoods, or simple scarves protected against frostbite. The peasant wardrobe, though modest, reflected careful attention to environmental adaptation. Survival depended on knowing when and how to layer, repair, and replace garments. Material culture extended to household objects as well. Cooking pots, wooden spoons, baskets, and simple tools were crafted with similar attention to durability, repairability, and multi-purpose functionality. A well-maintained tool could last decades. A broken one could jeopardize labor efficiency, food preparation, or overall household survival. Resourcefulness in textiles mirrored resourcefulness in other material objects. Mending, recycling, and adapting were constant practices. Humor and ingenuity were also present. Peasants often patched garments creatively, repurposed old cloth, or swapped clothing within the household to extend utility. A tunic with a dozen patches was not just a necessity, it was a visible testament to resourcefulness, patience, and problem-solving skills. And sometimes subtle jokes or symbolic patterns were woven into repairs, providing small relief in otherwise arduous routines. Finally, clothing and textiles served social functions. Proper maintenance, modest decoration, and seasonal adjustment signaled competence, family cohesion, and adherence to community norms. Even subtle markers, patterns, patches, or the state of repair communicated status, diligence, and reliability. These visual cues reinforced social cohesion and trust, critical components in a world where mutual aid, shared labor, and cooperation ensured survival. So as you imagine the village at dusk, with families repairing garments, spinning wool, and arranging bedding for the night, you see another layer of resilience.
Clothing, textiles, and material culture were mundane but essential. They provided warmth, protection, functionality, and subtle expressions of identity. Survival required careful attention to these objects, just as it required care in food, labor, and social bonds. Every patch, stitch, and thread contributed to the ongoing rhythm of endurance.
Part 16. Festivals, Leisure, and the Subtle Pleasures of Peasant Life. All right, let's slowly drift back to the village one last time, imagining smoke rising from chimneys, animals settling down for the night, and the faint hum of conversation fading as darkness descends. Life for medieval peasants was hard, repetitive, and exhausting, but it wasn't entirely joyless. Even in a world dominated by labor, scarcity, and survival, moments of leisure, festivals, and simple pleasures punctuated the rhythm of existence. Festivals were the highlight of the peasant calendar. Religious, seasonal, and communal celebrations offered breaks from daily toil. Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals, and local saints' days were marked with feasting, dancing, singing, and storytelling. These events were not only social, they were psychological and emotional relief. Peasants could gather, share food, exchange news, and temporarily escape the relentless cycle of labor. Even modest celebrations provided structure, community cohesion, and the comforting sense that life had rhythm beyond survival. Music and dance played central roles. Simple instruments, flutes, drums, or lutes borrowed from traveling performers accompanied folk songs and dances. Villagers sang while working, played at festivals, or accompanied rituals. These sounds reinforced community bonds, offered amusement, and allowed subtle emotional expression. Humor, irony, and gentle mockery were often woven into songs and stories, helping people process the absurdities and hardships of daily life. Storytelling was another form of leisure. Elders recounted tales of heroic or clever ancestors, moral lessons, or humorous incidents. Stories mixed entertainment, cautionary guidance, and cultural memory. Children learned not only moral lessons and practical knowledge, but also how to observe, interpret, and respond to social cues. Storytelling reinforced identity, continuity, and resilience. In essence, narrative was both amusement and education, quietly sustaining the community's mental and cultural health. Games and play existed alongside labor. Children and adults engaged in simple competitions, racing, jumping, throwing objects, or informal sports. Games allowed for physical exercise, skill building, and social interaction. Even modest leisure helped maintain mental and emotional well-being. Competition, humor, and play fostered cooperation, observation, and subtle problem-solving. These activities, though brief and informal, contributed meaningfully to village resilience. Humor permeated daily life as well. Wry jokes, gentle teasing, and ironic observation allowed villagers to cope with adversity. A burned loaf of bread or a stubborn goat might inspire laughter rather than frustration. Humor, subtle and understated, reinforced social bonds, provided emotional relief, and reminded villagers that, even in hardship, human ingenuity and perspective mattered. Laughing quietly at misfortune was itself a survival skill. Simple pleasures were valued highly. Freshly baked bread, a newly harvested vegetable, a well-tended animal, or a warm blanket offered satisfaction and relief. Observing nature, the first green shoots of spring, birds returning, or the changing seasons provided beauty and predictability. Small achievements, like successfully preserving food, repairing clothing, or teaching a child a useful skill, offered daily psychological reinforcement. Life was measured not only in survival, but in these modest victories and comforts. Community rituals reinforced cohesion. Weddings, christenings, funerals, and local fairs reminded villagers of their interconnectedness. Labor was shared, resources pooled, and knowledge exchanged. Emotional support, advice, and practical assistance flowed through these gatherings. Even if the world remained harsh, these collective experiences reinforced the subtle scaffolding that allowed villages to persist across generations. And finally, consider the cyclical nature of peasant life. Days flowed into weeks, seasons into years, with labor, care, and ritual forming a continuous rhythm. Work, food preparation, clothing maintenance, childcare, and festivals were interwoven. Survival depended not on dramatic heroism, but on patience, observation, cooperation, and occasional humor. The quiet, steady effort of countless generations ensured continuity, adaptation, and resilience. So, as you imagine the village at night, animals asleep, fires dimmed, and families resting, remember that life was not just about enduring hardship. It was about the subtle pleasures, communal bonds, small victories, and quiet humor that punctuated survival. Peasants survived because they worked, observed, adapted, cared, and occasionally laughed. They found meaning in daily labor, rhythm in seasons, and comfort in community. In the end, survival was cumulative, mundane, and profoundly human. It was not heroic in the traditional sense, not recorded in grand annals, not celebrated in lavish feasts, but it was intelligent, adaptive, and enduring. Peasants managed plagues, famine, harsh weather, and demanding lords not through extraordinary acts, but through persistent, quiet ingenuity. They observed, learned, taught, repaired, celebrated, and persevered. Their lives, though unremarkable to chroniclers, were sustained by the remarkable machinery of human resilience. And as the village sleeps, the fields await the next day, the hearth quietly cools, and the cycle continues. Life endures not in grand gestures, but in the patient, meticulous, and often overlooked rhythms of ordinary existence. And that, in the slow, repetitive, and subtly humorous fabric of medieval life, is the story of how peasants survived, day by day, generation by generation, season by season.